Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus pilot, and welcome to the takeoff tutorial in the iniBuilds Airbus A350. We're going to start this one with the lineup flows, and thereafter when we're on the runway we're going to go over everything important for our takeoff until we're eventually going to execute the takeoff, and this tutorial is going to finish with the after takeoff checklist down to the line completed. So let's get into it. At first we're going to start with our actual lineup, and for this we have a couple of things to take into consideration. First of all, we're not allowed to take off with the ANF selected, that's the airport navigation function, down here on the nav display. So be sure that you select the range to at least 10 up here on the nav display. I also recommend showing the SID chart down here. So let's go to the terminal charts, and over here we have already prepared it, because we thought along during the pre-flight, right? Okay, when that is done, we have to execute the lineup flow, and I'm simplifying a little bit here because it is separate for the pilot flying and the pilot monitoring, but we are only single pilot in our flight simulator. So we go packs off. If a packs off takeoff was planned, then we turn the strobe light on, and we ensure that the nose light is in taxi. If takeoff clearance is already received, we can turn on the landing light and the nose light into the takeoff position. Next, we move down to our EFIS control panels and select the weather radar and all the terrain as necessary. One idea might be to use weather on the pilot flying side, terrain on the pilot monitoring side, but you can vary that as needed. If you're departing in good weather in mountainous terrain, you might use terrain on both sides. Use that as needed. From there we go down and we select the TCAS into the above position, and should, for reasons of traffic in the area or for whatever reason, should the TCAS be required to be in TA only mode above 1000 feet, if you check this you can see it goes to TA only, that's traffic advisory only, no resolution advisories. It goes into that automatically for takeoff, but should it be required to be in that position for longer, you can select that manually on this button over here. Otherwise, just leave that off. When that's completed, we can do the before takeoff checklist below the line. So let's go to the checklist menu, and we have it right down here. So takeoff runway, we confirm that we're indeed at the runway where we intend to be. So we're in Bravo 3 Bravo, runway 35 left over here. That's confirmed. Cabin crew, advised, packs off. Yeah, they are off. And that's the before takeoff checklist complete. So before entering the runway, have a good look into the approach area, verify that you're entering the correct runway, and then we can line the aircraft up. A common mistake amongst flight simmers is to follow the yellow line when lining the aircraft up for your takeoff. You don't do that, because that line is meant for aircraft that are vacating the runway, not for aircraft that are entering it for a takeoff. So, common mistake there, to confuse the two and do that. Instead, what you do is you enter the runway at a 90-degree angle, and then you use a rather strong tiller input to make the turn as tight as possible. And that's done so that the aircraft is going to use up as little runway as possible during the actual lineup procedure. During that procedure, be sure to keep the ground speed at least at 5 knots, otherwise you have a risk of accidentally stopping the aircraft. When the lineup is complete, bring the aircraft to a complete stop. It is Airbus standard operating procedure that you take off from a standing position and not from a rolling position, even though rolling takeoffs are permitted as necessary. Alright, and with that we are now fully prepared. So let's now talk about the actual technique during our takeoff. Now there's a couple of things that we need to think about over here, and the first one is how are we going to conduct the takeoff itself. Now that's quite easy. You increase thrust to 25%, that's your first mark over there. Once both engines are stabilized, push your thrust levers forward into the flex MCT or into the toga notch as needed. Now, since we have calculated a flex takeoff, we are going to use the flex MCT detent. Now, If you are doing a flex takeoff, the crew can at any point increase thrust to toga as they see fit, should they, for whatever reason, desire to go to toga thrust. So that can always be done. Now, we are going to apply forward side stick input depending on the outside conditions. With no tailwind and a crosswind of 20 knots or less, we do half forward side stick input. That helps to push the nose down a little bit so that we have some weight on the nose wheel, while the engines, which are located below the aircraft's center of gravity, are somewhat lifting the nose up when the thrust is at a high setting. If we have tailwind or the crosswind is greater than 20 knots, then we're going to do full forward side stick for our takeoff. When we reach a speed of 80 knots, we slowly return our side stick so that it reaches neutral by the time we reach 100 knots. We're going to call 100 knots out and cross-check our speed indications. Now, at V1, we remove our hands from the thrust lever, and the aircraft is always going to call V1 out. You have an audio call out for that, which is quite nice. I really don't know why the A320 doesn't have that. So at V1, remove the hand from thrust lever. At VR, initiate a rotation of about 3 degrees per second. That's a tiny bit more than one of those markers on the ADI per second, towards an attitude of 12.5 degrees, which is your initial climb attitude. Now, the aircraft will lift off at approximately 10 degrees. Tail strike is a possibility, especially on the 1000, and you have a tail strike indicator on your primary flight display. You will see that coming up as we start the rotation later on. So don't get scared from it, keep rotating at a normal rate, but don't completely crash the aircraft into that indication. Now, there is one specialty for the A350 in a crosswind takeoff. Normally, on most aircraft, if you have a crosswind, the wind pushes so strong on the vertical stabilizer that the aircraft has a tendency to yaw into the wind. So let's say we have a left crosswind, the aircraft would have a tendency to yaw to the left. On the A350, it is the other way around. So on the Airbus A350, the so-called weathercock effect that reduces the thrust on the downwind engine is so strong that the upwind engine produces more thrust than the downwind engine, and therefore the aircraft has a tendency to turn downwind. So if the wind is coming from the left, the nose would turn to the right, which is counterintuitive. Until approximately 70 knots. From 70 knots onwards, that effect is going to cancel itself out, but that's very important to be aware of this. Now, we rotate the aircraft to 12.5 degrees, and from 5 seconds after liftoff, we can engage the autopilot. Now, I recently did a video on manual flight and how long pilots typically fly manually. If you're interested, do watch that. But for the purpose of the tutorial, we are going to engage the autopilot 5 seconds after liftoff, so that we have time to explain the procedures that are going to come after that with a sufficient amount of time available. So that much for our basics. Now, there is one more thing to mention here, and that is normally only pilot monitoring item, but yeah, we are 2 pilots in one, aren't we? That once your engines are set to takeoff thrust, and once takeoff thrust is reached, that's when you start the chronometer in order to time the time at which the engines are at takeoff thrust setting, so that you don't exceed the limit. We can cancel this out again once climb thrust is set, because the aircraft has an automatic flight timer down here, which starts to run as soon as the weight on wheel sensors sense that the aircraft is in the air. So you don't need to start an elapsed timer in the A350, but you do need to start the chronometer. Well, and that's our theoretical briefing completed. So we have set everything up, we are ready to go. So let's go, takeoff. The parking brake is released. We stabilize the engines at 25%. We have light winds today, so I'm using half forward side stick. The engines are stabilized. And here we go. Manual flex 69, SRS, auto thrust blue. Thrust is set, starting the timer. Use very small rudder inputs to keep your airplane on the runway centerline. It's really easy to do in the A350. At 80 knots we are slowly going to return our side stick to neutral. 100 knots, cross-checked. Hand off thrust lever, rotate. And we're looking at 3 degrees per second. Positive climb, gear up. And 5 seconds have passed. Autopilot 1. When we reach the acceleration altitude and the thrust reduction altitude, we'll see lever climb flash on the FMA up here. And when that happens, we're going to pull our thrust levers back into the climb detent. Do that slowly, as the engines are running along. Thrust, declimb, climb, auto thrust. As we're now accelerating, when passing the F speed, in case you take off with more than flaps in config 1+F, otherwise when passing the S speed with a positive trend vector, we are going to retract the flaps into the 0 position, disarm the ground spoilers, turn the nose light off, and we can turn on both packs. Do note that we can turn them on without any waiting time in between, as the A350 can handle that, contrary to the A320 or A330. Well, and that's our entire takeoff SOP completed. So once the flaps are retracted, as you can see on the indicator down on the primary flight display, we can run the after takeoff checklist. So press the checklist menu down here, and we can see that all the items above the line are sensed by the computer, so you can already close the checklist again. Now, here is one specialty. If you are flying an aircraft at a very low weight and you have to use full toga thrust, for example because of possible wind shear conditions, then it is permissible to avoid a significant rate of climb from developing. Then it is permissible to reduce your thrust to climb thrust once you are above an altitude of 400 feet. In that case, don't retract the flaps though until you are above the acceleration altitude and the aircraft is positively accelerating. Well, and that completes the takeoff tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this one interesting. Be sure to leave your feedback in the comments underneath the video. Don't forget to cancel the chrono again or keep it running as per your desires once you're in climb thrust. And with all of that, thank you very much for watching. As always, be sure to like, comment and subscribe. And if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.